Part 1. The DC Universe and Multiverse. Hey guys, before we get the superhero party started, let's first check out the universe that these characters inhabit. At first glance, it seems very similar to our own. Most of the stories take place on Earth, and history has generally progressed in much the same way as it has for us. That is up until the late 1930s, when these characters are first created and burst to life in the pages of DC Comics. But before we get to the nitty-gritty of just how the DC Universe works, let's first briefly examine the history of comics, and how that has affected the storylines and characters we know and love. Now, since superhero comics have been around since the year 1938, comic book creators and historians have since divided the years into 4 distinct eras, known as the Golden, Silver, Bronze, and Modern Ages. Starting with the Golden Age, which includes all the comics published from 1938 to the end of 1955, our first dose of superheroes aren't all sunshine, freedom, and the American way. Instead, many of these comics were influenced by the gritty, violent, and sexually scandalous pulp novels of the time. And then later, the bloody reality of World War II. This can be seen mostly in the genre comics of the 1950s. That is, anthology comics, specializing in crime, suspense, horror, and even romance stories. Horrific crimes, gore, and sexualized violence were the bread and butter of the crime and horror comics. So when the parents of these children reading these comics found out just what their kids were into, the backlash was pretty brutal. The parents of the 1950s became worried that these comics were corrupting their children, turning them into rebellious juvenile delinquents. Though it was probably just hormones. In an effort to break these comics' hold on their kids, members of the public began to burn comic books in public gatherings. And of course, like every reactionary movement, this quest to bring down comics found a leader in the psychiatrist Frederick Wertham. Wertham's book, Seduction of the Innocent, solidified these beliefs by blaming the violence and depravity portrayed in comics as a cause for society's ills. Now, this being the 1950s, other supposed horrors to be found in comics included feminism and perceived homosexuality. So, obviously this guy wasn't the most progressive, but then, what did we expect? Unsurprisingly, these ideas gained huge support, and led to the creation of the Comics Code Authority, which put restrictions on what could be portrayed in comics. This basically killed off the crime and horror comics of the day, and led to the Silver Age of comics, where the stories were made to be a little more family-friendly, or at least clean enough to get past the CCA censors, as now, all scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism, masochism shall not be permitted. Now, while the institution of these comic book constables jammed up lots of artists, the fallout wasn't all bad. Superhero comics, which had taken a bit of a back seat to genre comics, came roaring back into the spotlight. While the beginning of the space race between Russia and the USA inspired comic book writers and artists to have their characters reach for the stars, as science fiction and aliens became the hot topic of the era. This age lasted until the end of the 1960s, before the influx of civil and women's rights movements helped usher in the Bronze Age at the beginning of 1970. Having lived through the groovy 60s and all the changes that took place there, the writers at DC once again shifted their tone to appeal to the socially conscious youth that made up most of their readers. Many of these costume characters began to tackle problems of modern-day society that would appeal to both the youth of the times as well as their parents. Stories showing the evils of drug addiction, destruction of the environment, and racism began to dot the landscape. But by the end of 1984, people in the comic book industry started to realize that most of their readers were growing up, and a market for more mature storylines was just waiting to be exploited. Which brings us to the modern age of comics, starting in 1985. Here, many of the writers and creators of comics shrugged off the approval of the Comics Code Authority in order to tell the grittier and more mature stories that would keep their readership happy. That's not to say that all comic books became like this, but a vast majority did. Even though the modern age began in the mid-1980s, we are technically still in it here in 2016. I guess things haven't changed all that much. Well, that is as long as we ignore 1990s comic industry's obsession with making things extreme. It's a phase we'd all like to forget. In the next section of this video, we'll examine how these historical eras have affected the storylines of DC Comics, and how they led to the creation of the DC Multiverse.